Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the digital studios at the Cape Town Conversations. I'm here with Renato Baumann and with Gladys Lechini, and we are going to be talking about de-stressing the balance sheet, lifting debt-trapped nations. This is a very contentious topic. We have here a South African, an Argentinian, and a Brazilian. So this topic has very much been a part of our lives, whether we were economic researchers or policymakers or not. And I think maybe just to start things going, in terms of the way we wanted to frame this conversation, it was very much about owning the fact that if there is a legacy of debt, one is not on a level playing field. There is an impact on every plan that can be made for the future if you have this lodestone around one's neck. And there have been, over the decades, multiple attempts on a multilateral and on a bilateral basis to try and resolve this issue. And I think we can all agree that the entire way through the 20th century and well into the 21st, this is still something that we have not been able to crack. So I want to turn to you, Gladys, and just in terms of the research that you have done in Latin America, across the African continent, what is the observation that you can share with us in terms of what these issues are? What has worked in multilateral fora? What has not?
Well, generally speaking, in the case of financing an external debt, what I really feel is that it has not helped the countries that received the loans, because it's not well coordinated, and either those who are the givers or the receivers, they are both to be blamed to a certain extent. The big explosion was in the 80s in the case of how the external debt provoked a big crisis, the first biggest crisis in Latin America. And then the Cartagena consensus, that for me is not consensus, because despite the fact that Argentina's government promoted a certain type of policy, just blaming either the receivers like the donors because it was a political co-responsibility, the consensus did not work and it failed, and each country had to decide by itself. In the case of Argentina, we began like going down and downwards up to the present situation that's quite complicated.
Absolutely. And Renato, if I can turn to you, just in terms of the context that Gladys has set, if one reads what is written about Brazil in many multilateral forma, from the World Bank, from the IMF's perspective, Brazil is a country that in many ways has gotten it right, or at least better than some of its peers, from a debt management and a fiscal policy perspective. As a senior economic researcher, as a Brazilian, can you give us an insight on what you think your country has gotten right and where perhaps there is room for improvement?
Well, Brazil has adopted a policy of building up international currency reserves for quite some time. Reserves are pretty high. This was fashionable and recommended in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. And that had made a very comfortable situation in terms of balance of payments. One. Two, whatever the small external debt that the country has is not public debt, it's private debt, which is a totally different scenario from the 1980s. Now, overall, what we have right now is that you have some 54 countries that are having very strong debt problems. And most of them are middle-income countries. Why so? Because they have taken lots of loans. They have opted for euro bonds. They have opted for bilateral credit from new creditors, such as Saudi Arabia, China, and so on. And there was the COVID, and there has been the Russia-Ukraine impact. That has led to a very sharp increase in interest rates. Therefore, you have a double situation right now, where some countries lack liquidity. And for that, the IMF is there. But still, the IMF programs have not attracted as many countries as was expected, one. Two, a good deal of those countries is middle income, and they don't qualify for those lines, IMF lines, credit lines. So you have a triple situation. You have those countries that are desperate for liquidity, and for them, like Zambia, Sri Lanka, the IMF, they have silent IMF programs, and they have, that means to be submitted to a sharp number of conditions, and then the Paris Club renegotiation, and so on and so forth. You have a second group, which are countries that have bilateral debt with China. And why is that relevant? Because one, a good deal of those of loans by China have collateral in terms of real estate or production. And what the negotiations at the Paris Club, the creditors, most of the creditors have accepted concessional renegotiation, where not so China. China requires on commercial basis. Why so? Because a good deal of Chinese revenue depends upon the Belt and Road Initiative. So cannot, one, and two, there are diversified number of Chinese creditors. And the third condition are the middle income countries, which are most of those 54. And they don't qualify for IMF typical support lines. And some of them do not need liquidity. What they need is a renegotiation of their present condition, because the interest rate has gone upwards. So it's a complex thing. Some things can be done at the multilateral level, and other things have to be done in terms of bilateral terms.
Absolutely, and you raise a very interesting point, because I suppose the origin of the debt issue is the 1980s. That is where we saw the extreme levels of proliferation of debt instruments that we now see here.
Some of the intense debt situation is more recent, far more recent.
That's true.
At the early 2000s.
That's true. That is
Why
true.
so? Because concessional credit, the ODA has gone down very significantly, so countries opted for other sources of funds. And then COVID, Russia, Ukraine, interest rate upwards.
And so the level of debt that is actually supportable has matrix has
gone
gone
up
down.
and unpredictable.
Exactly
intensity.
that. But what is interesting in terms of what you've said is that I suppose 50 years ago there was the official international capital markets on a commercial basis, and there was official overseas aid. And these days, what makes the situation so much more complex is that there is an enormous area of grey with different debt packages, with different sets of conditionalities, where components are commercially driven, components are aid-based, and it makes it far more complicated to understand the aggregate debt position, particularly when you have a multiplicity of donors. And perhaps, Gladys, if I can turn to you, if you could maybe talk about, in terms of, you spoke about a challenge being the lack of coordination in terms of debt, and perhaps this has become even more so in terms of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, and we see this problem, the lack of cooperation, of coordination, from the 80s onwards, either at the multilateral level of multilateral political institutions or financial institutions. The debate on UN and all the other organizations about what to do in the next future, unilateralism, multilateralism, are at stake at every moment. Yeah. And besides, as you have said, the agents, the multilateral, the myriad of multilateral various actors playing in the ground has complicated the scene. And the post-world, this new world order is very frightening and with not visible limits. So everything could happen, and like Ukraine, like even Hamas and Israel is not so unpredictable, but some other explosions could happen, and we don't know where we are going to.
Absolutely. And I think I want to pick up, perhaps as a last question, Renato, before we have to wrap up. We cannot have this conversation without introducing China and some of the other, I don't want to call them necessarily donor, but creditor nations who have shifted the landscape over the last couple of decades, where we look at parts of the world like Africa, like Latin America, and in Southeast Asia as well. And this is not just China. India is a big player. Saudi Arabia is a big player. Turkey is a big player. Russia is a big player. What has the rise and influence of these countries as creditor nations done to the debt landscape, in your opinion?
When we go back to the 70s, there was plenty of money, the oil rich now, oil wealth. Recently, remember, there was a whole debate, end of inflation. And interest rates in the main economies have been kept down in unprecedented for a very long period. At the same time that ODA, the official assistance, has come down. So it was logic for a number of countries to try and go to the market and get resources. Some of them have used those funds efficiently. Some of them have dealt with corruption and maluse of the resources. Now, when this situation came to a limit, you have now this corner situation where new creditors do not belong to the price club, have a different logic. You have geopolitical constraints related to not only the Russian-Ukrainian war, but well before the war, some increasing efforts to try and adopt quote-unquote anti-Western movements, the SWIFT, interbanking, things like that, which brings a set of new dimensions to the market. Geopolitical dependency, so to speak, with relation to other specific countries. Won't name here specific countries, but still, for instance, China did not accept the IMF conditions with regard to Zambia. And that was not predicted in the common feature program by the IMF. No one could expect that. And that makes the whole situation very peculiar right now. You have a debt situation very much needed to be solved because you need resources to provide growth. We are talking about developing economies or underdeveloped economies, and yet there is this mixed set of situations on multilateral and bilateral. So there has been some efforts in reallocating SDRs, in increasing IMF creating some credit lines, and so on and so forth. The BRICS have the reserve agreement, which has never been tested, but still, there are some possibilities on the table. But the whole scenario is far more complex than what we were used to deal with.
I think that's a very good point to end on. As a banker, I can attest to the fact that something that is absolutely necessary for debt is predictability. What we have learned in the current context is that there is very little predictability, if anything at all. We are watching flocks of black swans pass us by at this point while we try to navigate a geopolitical landscape. And that is going to make debt management that much harder to achieve. Thank you very much.